Well, shalom, my dear brothers and sisters in Messiah, in Yeshua, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. And welcome to our ongoing study in the book of First Corinthians. So today we will be in chapter 7 of First Corinthians. And I think as we dig into this book of the Bible, I think you will agree with me that this is one of the most challenging and difficult chapters in the Bible. But at the same time, it's one of the most important um, and very practical. Not only with reference to things that were going on in the biblical age, but also in our day and age as well. So let me kind of introduce the subject of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It is related to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where we were introduced to the problem of sexual immorality in the church at Corinth. And particularly the guy who was having an inappropriate physical relationship with his father's wife, either his birth mother or his stepmother. And so Paul addresses that situation and then kind of springboards off of that. He was obviously concerned about the sexual immorality in the congregation at Corinth, but he was also concerned with the fact that nothing was being done about it. There was no church discipline being administered. And so he kind of springboards off the lack of church discipline in his writings in the 6th chapter of First Corinthians. But it's also in that chapter that he kind of goes back to the subject of sexual immorality and reminds the Corinthians that people who engage in a wide variety of sexual immorality, as well as other sins, they are not going to be among those who inherit the kingdom of God. They're not going to receive eternal life. So today he continues with the subject of sexuality, particularly as it relates to the subject of marriage. And so the subjects that we will be dealing with today will involve marriage, singleness, also divorce for those who are married, the possibility of remarriage for divorced people, and just like every conceivable situation that you can imagine where those subjects will be dealt with. Just a reminder that God's plan for human sexuality was that all of it was to take place within the bonds of marriage, within the institution of marriage. And if you're not married, you don't get to have sex, at least if you want to be in the will of God in that particular area of human experience. So with those things in mind, we will make a quick run through our PowerPoint introduction to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we will also look at some foundational Bible passages that have to do with the subjects of marriage and divorce and possibility of remarriage and singleness. So let's go ahead and dive in here. I always like to take an opportunity to do some shameless advertising for a couple of books that I've written that have to do with the subject that we're studying. So I've written kind of a history book on the Second Temple era called Yeshua, He Will Be Called a Nazarene. And then I have done a more focused commentary on First and Second Corinthians. The best place to obtain my books is on Amazon. The English version of the Bible that we will be using for First Corinthians is the Tree of Life version. It is a Messianic Jewish version of the Bible. And the thing that you will notice most often is that all of the names in the Bible have not been anglicized. They appear in their original Hebrew pronunciation and the way they're written in Hebrew. That's not completely true of all the names in the Bible. But I guess you would say it's the standout names. In other words, Jesus, as his name appears in most English Bibles, turns into Yeshua. And some of the names are changed and some of them aren't. In the complete Jewish Bible, complete Jewish Bible? Yeah. By David Stern, all of the names appear in their Hebrew version. Another characteristic of the Tree of Life version is there are some Jewish cultural things that we will comment on as we go. We've also been looking at the chronology just to remind us where the book of Corinthians falls in the first century chronology and where Paul's his agenda falls on the timeline. So the church at Corinth was founded in the second missionary journey of Paul and his traveling companion Silas. The books of First and Second Corinthians were written during Paul's third missionary journey, most of the time was spent in Ephesus. But Paul was still doing ministry with the Corinthians kind of long distance by writing letters and making a few trips to Corinth as well. So that's where that stands. These are just maps of the second and third missionary journeys of Paul. So you can kind of follow the red line and see where he was when various things were happening. This is a chart that we have that itemizes all of the various letters that Paul wrote and letters that were written to him so Paul writing to the Corinthians and the Corinthians writing to Paul, and also the various visits that he made to that church. And there's probably more letters and more visits than you would have thought. Let's go ahead and get into some of the important biblical foundational teachings on the subjects that we'll be addressing today. And the first place we want to visit is in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy. This is part of the Torah, the law of Moses, which is the law that governed the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. So this is what the Old Testament had to say about divorce. Verse 1, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes. And that's exactly what the Hebrew says. It talks about finding favor she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her. The word uncleanness is going to be kind of critical in our understanding what this passage is trying to tell us. It is the Hebrew word ervat, and also the word davar, which means a word or a matter of. Ervat. Ervat is the Hebrew word for nakedness. And it has some, derived meanings also. Which were the subject of some debate and disagreement in the biblical era. But just remember that ervat means nakedness, which implies some form of sexuality. In this case, it would be sexual immorality. So if the husband has found some uncleanness, some sexual immorality in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hands, and sends her out of his house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that it is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So the first thing I want to point out about this passage is this is part of the law of the old covenant. And First Corinthians is about the new covenant. So it is quite possible that the law that governs the new covenant will be slightly different. It may or may not be different from the law of the old covenant. So we will also look, before we get into our text today, we'll also look at some of Jesus' teachings about the subject of divorce and also singleness. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background to this passage from Deuteronomy. This passage was the subject of great debate among Jewish scholars at the time of Jesus and beforehand, during the Second Temple era. There were two schools of thought on what this Bible passage is teaching. There was a very strict and conservative interpretation, and then there was a more permissive and liberal interpretation. Let me give you the liberal interpretation first, and it was represented by the school of Hillel. Hillel was a great rabbi in Judaism and was known for his, more liberal and permissive interpretations of the Bible. And he focused mainly on this phrase that she finds no favor in his eyes. So Hillel said that if a couple is married and the husband basically has anything against his wife, he can divorce her. And the famous example that that Hillel gave, is that if a wife burns her husband's breakfast, and I assume this would be on a regular basis, like a daily basis, that would be sufficient to finding no favor in his eyes, and so she could divorce him for burning his breakfast. So basically, according to Hillel's interpretation, you could divorce your wife for any reason that you wanted. Then the more conservative and strict interpretation of this was represented by the school of Shammai. Shammai was another, greatly respected and famous and popular rabbi. And his interpretation was that the finding no favor in the eyes of her husband could only be with reference to one area of her life, and that was some uncleanness that the husband found, ervat, some nakedness, some sexual immorality, or something like that. And he said that was the only biblically permissible reason for a husband to divorce his wife. And usually that's the direction the divorce went. It was usually a husband divorcing his wife. But I have heard that a wife could also divorce her husband. Like if she catches him having an affair, then she could write him a certificate of divorce. So I guess it could work both ways, but it was usually the husband who divorced his wife. And so that's what you really need to know about this text. There were two very popular opinions about what this text meant. Actually, the main teaching of this text is that if a husband does divorce his wife and sends her away, if she gets married again, and it would seem to imply that a divorced person could be married under the law of or could be remarried under the law of Moses, then if that second husband divorced her, or if he died and she became eligible again, the first husband could not marry her. So once divorced, always divorced from that particular spouse, from that particular husband or wife. So I think that's about as far as we want to go with this, and with this passage, and look at Jesus' teaching on this same subject. Now, Jesus teaches on the subject of divorce in several places in the Gospels. Once in the Sermon on the Mount, And again, here in Matthew chapter 19, which occurred later in his ministry. So this is what his teaching was. And by the way, the background to this is that uh, Jesus was confronted by the scribes and the Pharisees and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, basically his enemies in Judaism. And they wanted to get him on record as either supporting the school of Hillel or the school of Shammai. So, I mean, usually Jesus would kind of maneuver his way around answering these kind of questions, but he answers it very directly. And keep in mind that this teaching from Matthew is the law of the new covenant. So here's what Jesus said in response. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. So let's stop there. Let's pause there for a moment and realize that Jesus acknowledges that there are certain situations that in which divorce is permitted, not required, but permitted. So, and he also emphasizes that it is permitted because of the hardness of men's hearts. So, because of sinfulness, God permitted divorce. But Jesus goes on to say, but from the beginning, it was not so. And I think in another context, he references the creation story where Adam and Eve are created. And, you know, for this cause, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then later, the New Testament adds the phrase, what God has joined together, let man not separate. So God's first best will is his primary view of divorce is that he hates it. There's a Bible passage that says God hates divorce, and he does. But because of the hardness of men's hearts, he permits it under certain situations. So Jesus acknowledges that, but he reminds not only his critics, but all of us, you know, his followers as well, that from the beginning it was not so. God intended marriage to be a lifelong experience until, you know, until death parts us, until one of the spouses dies, in which case the surviving spouse is free to remarry. That situation may come up here in 1 Corinthians 7. I can't remember if it does or not, but there's no doubt about that. If you're a widow or a widower and you find somebody you want to be married to for the rest of your life, and her life or his life, then you are permitted to do that. So what Jesus says in verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. And the Greek word for this, New Testament written in Greek, is porneia, which we've already talked about. That is a biblical term, a Greek term for sexual immorality of a wide variety of types. And we've also pointed out the fact that this is kind of the root word of our word pornography, which is like a curse on our society. It's so readily available. And that's, you know, looking at pornography and following through action-wise on that is that is an act of sexual immorality. So here, Jesus is siding with Shammai, isn't he? He is not taking a liberal position that you can divorce your wife or your husband for any reason you want to. He says, except for sexual immorality. And that divorced wife marries another. She commits adultery, and the guy, whoever marries her, who is divorced, also commits adultery. Now, like, why would that be? It's because if in any other situation other than sexual immorality, God still recognizes the legitimacy of the original marriage. And so even if there is a divorce, if it's for another reason other than sexual immorality, God doesn't recognize the divorce. Human law might, but God doesn't. And so anyone who marries that divorced woman who shouldn't be divorced, in God's opinion, commits adultery. The woman commits adultery, and whoever marries her, the guy who takes her as his wife, also commits adultery, because in God's view, she's still married. So his disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it's better not to marry. And chapter 7 is going to address that situation as well. So from the teaching of Deuteronomy chapter 24 and from Yeshua's teaching in Matthew 19 and other places in the New Testament, we understand that divorce is sometimes recognized by God, but only in cases of sexual immorality. Well, in this chapter, chapter 7, Paul is going to take upon himself the apostolic authority to bind and loose, laws and practices of God's people. And he is going to add another exception to the rule. And it's usually referred to as malicious desertion. And we will address that when we come to it. So the thing I want you to take away from this is that under the law of the New Covenant, there are two occasions that the Bible, in which the Bible permits a divorce to take place. One is sexual immorality, and the other is malicious desertion. But let's follow up on the comment of his disciples. In other words, Jesus has taken such a strict position on this subject. His disciples are going, wow, this makes marriage, divorce, sexual immorality very challenging and very difficult. Well, the New Covenant does that in a lot of areas, including this idea of looking lustfully at a person of the opposite gender, or nowadays the same gender, or whatever gender they identify with, and desiring to have sex with a person, even if you don't touch them, even if you never have physical contact with them. Jesus says you've committed adultery in your heart. And maybe it's not just as bad as physical adultery or sexual immorality, but it's bad. It's still a sin, and still has consequences. So what does Jesus have to say about celibacy, about remaining single, not to marry? He said to them, all cannot accept this saying being what his disciples said to him, it's better not to marry. So Jesus said to them, all cannot accept this saying that it's better not to marry, but only those to whom it has been given, which teaches us that for some people, God's plan for their life is that they be single, that they not be married at all. And of course, that can occur for a variety of different reasons, and Jesus is going to address them. He says, for there are eunuchs. The Greek word is eunuchos, and the equivalent word in the Hebrew used in the Old Testament and some of the modern Hebrew translations of the New Testament is the Hebrew word saris. And both of those words mean literally they mean a castrated male. And there were a variety of reasons that males were castrated. But it also has a more figurative use of the term. In other words, if a man remains single by choice or by calling or whatever the reason is, he need not be physically castrated. He can be, what would you call it? Spiritually castrated, or according to his commitment and his devotion. You don't have to be castrated to be a eunuch, but that's what the word in Hebrew and Greek means. So basically, for our purposes, we're going to say that the word eunuch has reference to a single person. So Jesus says there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb. In other words, there was a vow of celibacy taken by the parents of a child before he was born. Samuel is an example of that. I think John the Baptist is an example of that. There are numerous examples of men or women, I suppose, who were vowed to celibacy by their parents. They didn't have any choice, and usually their parents, maybe in every case, intended that to be a lifelong devotion of their child. Now, some would say, well, that's unfair of the parents to do that to a child. And maybe it is, but God takes vows seriously. So that's one situation. A person can be a eunuch born that way from his or her mother's womb. There are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. Now, this is where the subject of literal castration comes in, because oftentimes a king or some kind of a noble person um, utilizes officers and officials who have responsibility in his court. And those officials have great privileges and great power and influence, but it was not uncommon for them to be castrated. And an obvious reason for that is that many of those officers would have contact with the king's harem. And a harem was like a collection of women that were supposed to provide sexual pleasure for the king. And to remove any doubt that the officer, the official in his court, was also being pleasured by these women, these men were castrated to kind of remove all doubt that they would ever be tampering with the king's men. So that's what Jesus is talking about here. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. Now, that was kind of an honorable situation where a person would be made a eunuch by a king or a noble person or a master if it was a slave. But it could also be a way that let's say, a conqueror could demonstrate his superiority over the conquered by removing portions of their genitals. So that's how eunuchs can be made eunuchs by men. But Jesus goes on to say there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. So there are three occasions, three situations, three circumstances that Yeshua talks about here, where men might be considered eunuchs, either physically or what, mentally or spiritually, eunuchs, single people. And Paul is going to embrace, in chapter 7, Paul is going to embrace being a eunuch for himself, being unmarried. Now, this may mean that he was single all of his life. It may mean that he was married at one point in his life, but his wife died. And some scholars have said that Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and in order to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you had to be married. I've never seen that before, but that may be the case. I think it's also possible that Paul was married, but because of God's calling on his life, he was like physically separated from his wife just because of his travels and because of his ministry. So even if he was married, at the time of his ministry, he had to behave himself as a single man. So, okay, those are the teachings on divorce, remarriage, celibacy, and so forth. So let's dive into this text and see if that little background study helps us to parse this and figure out what the Apostle Paul is talking to us about. 1 Corinthians 7:1, now concerning the things about which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, which sounds vaguely similar to what the disciples of Jesus said to him. It's like it's better for a man not to marry, right? The word touch is in the Greek text. It's haptesthai, and it means to touch and a variety of other things, to hold and so forth. But here, the specific They call it a gloss. The interpretation for this particular passage is that it means to touch a woman in a sexual way, which, remember, God only permits within the confines of marriage. So apparently the Corinthians had written this statement to him: it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I think some of the English translations have phrased it as a question: is it good for a man not to touch a woman? So we know from this that the Corinthians were thinking in these terms. They were thinking maybe it's better for people to remain single than to marry. And that's the subject that Paul's going to address, which is odd because of all the sexual immorality that was going on in that town. And we learned, even in that church, that people were thinking about being single, remaining single, becoming eunuchs, male or female, I suppose. But because of much immorality, he says in verse 2, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. So verse 2 is saying that God has provided marriage for human beings. And remember, God's rules about marriage is it's one man and one woman in a lifelong, committed, loving, and faithful relationship. The same-sex marriage thing is condemned in the Bible, no matter how acceptable it is in modern society. And gender confusion is condemned in the Bible as well. So there's a lot of sexual immorality going on in our world. And Paul is saying here, one of the reasons that God has provided marriage, not the primary one, probably the primary one, is for reproduction, so the planet can be populated. And, people who study the subject of population, like world population, are really concerned that the birth rate is not keeping up with the death rate. And that can cause problems for the human population, but that's beside the point. So one of the reasons that Paul says marriage is given is to help sinful human beings deal with the influence of sexual immorality in the world, pornography and stuff like that. So that's one of the reasons that God likes marriage, is because a man and a woman who might be inclined to commit sexual immorality, if they get married, they can have a legitimate sexual relationship, and that might save them. It might prevent them from committing a sexual immorality. So that's, one of God's reasons for instituting a marriage. Now, a lot of people nowadays know that that doesn't always work that way, particularly with the availability of pornographic materials. There are an awful lot of married people who, in their secret little sex chamber, view pornography and masturbate and fantasize about having sex with someone other than their spouse. But pornography was available in the biblical era, but not as available as it is today. So marriage is not a total resolution to temptations to sexual immorality, but it helps. Verse 3, let the husband fulfill his obligation to his wife, and likewise also the wife to the husband. He goes on to say in verse 4, the wife does not have rights to her own body, but the husband, like the husband has rights to her body. Likewise, also, the husband does not have rights to his own body, but the wife. Do not deprive one another except by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then let's see what the C note is here. Yeah, some of the manuscripts say fasting and prayer, but the Tree of Life version does not add the subject of fasting. But that's a legitimate spiritual discipline. Then come together again. So abstain for a while, for an agreed upon length of time, and then come together again, so that Satan doesn't tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Okay, so God provides marriage as a at least a partial antidote to the influence of sexual immorality in a culture. Um, but he also, how shall we say this? The rights and privileges to a spouse's body is not their own. It's given to their spouse. So, in other words, the wife's body is provided by God for the husband to have a legitimate outlet for natural sexual drives and passions and things like that, and vice versa, the husband's body too. So in verse 5, he says, don't deprive one another except by mutual consent, which is fine and probably even good. A short period of abstinence from helps you with your self control. It helps build discipline in your lives. But also, I think this could be applied to another situation where a spouse gets angry with their partner and so deprives them of sex. And it's usually the wife depriving the husband, because I think it's generally agreed that a man's sex drive and needs kind of in quotation marks are stronger than the woman. So her body can become a weapon that she can use to hurt her husband, and vice versa. The husband can withhold sex from his wife as a way of communicating to her that he's not happy with her. Going back to the Old Testament, um, uh, David's first wife, Michal was her name, King Saul's daughter, incidentally, um, kind of reprimanded her husband for his public behavior. And David took exception to that. And the Bible tells us that she never bore children by him, and he never slept with her again. So David withheld sex from his wife to impress upon her how dissatisfied he was with her reaction to his behavior. Well, Paul would say, don't do that. He would say David was wrong for doing that. David was human. He committed other sins as well. Also, I think it's worth noting that Satan seems to be the tempting agent when it comes to lack of self-control. Now, self-control, usually in the Bible, has reference to control of your sex drives. And it's one of the fruits of the Spirit. It's the last one. I think it's the most challenging one. But because it's a fruit of the Spirit, I get the impression that a human being is incapable, particularly in a sexually immoral environment. A human being is incapable of controlling his sexual urges or her sexual urges, because Satan knows how to push people's buttons and make them do things that they don't want to do. Pornography addiction and sex addiction. I mean, actual, physical interaction with other people in a sexual way is a very addictive thing for a variety of reasons that I wish we could go into, but we don't have time to do that. But sexual immorality has its origin in this guy, Satan. And of course, he has legions of fallen angels, and he also has the demons at his beck and call to make life miserable for human beings. And that is a very common weakness. It was in the biblical era, and it is in our modern era, sexual immorality. So marriage is one, like I say, kind of a partial remedy. Verse 6, Paul says, but I say this as a concession, not as a command. So these are what he has just discussed are things that God permits, but does not command. Okay? Yet I wish that all men were like me. And the implication here is that Paul is single or married and behaving as if he is single. Let's say that he is behaving himself as a sexually moral a human being. His body is under control because he has the Holy Spirit living in it. Yeah, he's either single or because of his circumstances having to live as if he were single. He's behaving himself sexually. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this way and another in that. And this is in keeping with Jesus' teaching on singleness or being a eunuch. Paul is acknowledging, like Jesus did, not everybody can accept being single. So if you can't deal with it, I mean, if you're sinning, then look at marriage as a possible solution to that. Verse 8, he says, "But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them to remain as I am." So for people who are single and to widows, those who have lost their spouse, Paul is saying, my best advice to you would be for you to remain single. If you can deal with it, if it's going to cause you to commit sexual immorality, then consider getting married. And he says unmarried, which could be a single person who's never been married, or it could be a person who maybe once was married but now is divorced. Paul's advice to them is don't get married. But if they do not have self-control, he says in verse 9, then let them marry. Consider marriage as a possible remedy. For it is better to marry than to burn with desire. Now, the words with desire are not in the Greek text. It just says to burn. But I mean, it makes it sound like if you commit sexual immorality, then God's going to set your body on fire. Well, probably not. Because, I mean, like if that were the case, there'd be a lot of burned up bodies in the world. So I think this is talking about burning with passion or burning with desire. But there's also kind of an eternal application to this. If you are caught up in sexual immorality and you don't repent and don't change your ways and get born again and get the fruit of the Spirit going in your life, then you'll spend eternity in hell. And one of the characteristics of hell is to burn. So he may be saying it's better to marry than to burn forever in hell. Or what? I guess the more practical thing, it's better to marry than to burn with passion and possibly commit sexual immorality, which could possibly lead to you burning for eternity in hell. But to the married, I command, not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to be separated from her husband. Now, first of all, let's talk about this. He's giving a command. The teaching before, he said, was kind of permissive, but not a command from God. Well, this is a command. And it's a command not from Paul. This is not a command by Paul's authority, but it's from the Lord. So it sounds like Paul is saying some of the stuff that I command you to do or not to do is from the Lord, and some of it's just from me, according to my apostolic authority. So let's don't go into great depth about this, but what Paul is saying right here in this verse is that what I'm about to say to you is from the Lord and not from me. This is not just my opinion. This is the Lord's point of view. A wife is not to be separated from her husband. So that's God's first best will. And we saw that in Deuteronomy 24, and we saw it in Matthew 19, Yeshua's teaching on that subject. So God doesn't want you to be divorced. But the very next verse says, but if she is separated, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Here it implies, in verse 10, it implies that a wife is not to be separated from her husband, which may imply that she can write him a certificate of divorce. And then God gives the other side of the coin, that a husband is not to divorce his wife and a wife not divorce her husband. It may just mean that God doesn't want the wife to obey in such a manner that the husband will want to divorce her. So wives, behave yourself and make your husband want to keep you and not divorce you for either biblical or unbiblical reasons. So the gist here is God's first best for every married couple is to stay married. But if she gets separated, if she is a divorce, and let's see, in verse 11, the word for separated is choresthai, which means separated, probably mainly it means physically separated from your husband, but it can also mean emotionally separated. There are a lot of marriages that take place under one roof, but emotionally and mentally speaking, those people are separated. There is a wall or a barrier between the two, and God doesn't want either one of those to happen. So either physically or mentally and emotionally separated. God doesn't want that to happen. And if a husband is separated from his wife, this isn't. It doesn't necessarily include divorce. Divorce is a legal thing, and it ends the bonds of marriage, either in a God-pleasing way or a God-displeasing way. Separation can be just like a physical getting away from each other for a period of time. I worked with another pastor in one of the churches that I led, and that pastor was very much convinced that one of the best things that a marriage counselor, particularly a biblical marriage counselor, could suggest to a couple that wasn't getting along is just spend some time apart. One of you get an apartment or something like that and just separate for a while and kind of like if those two stay together, it's going to be like throwing gasoline on a fire. It's just going to make things worse. So he used to counsel people to separate, like a trial separation for a while, which would allow that if a woman was separated in that manner, she could either remain like she shouldn't be looking for a husband. She could remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. It could still be worked out. But this kind of separation can also, it could include divorce. It doesn't necessarily mean divorce, but it can mean divorce. In which case, if a woman is divorced, she should either remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Now, remember, Deuteronomy 24 said that if a wife is divorced and remarries, she can't come back to the original husband. But if if she's divorced and hasn't remarried, then it may be God pleasing that the two reconcile and get back together again. But if she marries somebody else, then she and the first husband are done for. Okay, let's see. Verse 12. But to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. So remember, Paul just said, I've got a command for you. That's not my opinion, but it's from the Lord. Now the shoe's on the other foot. Now he's saying, to the rest I say, not the Lord. So he's saying, what I'm about to say is not a teaching, a command that I received from the Lord. But he may be saying it's like a logical progression of like we have a commandment, and now there's a logical playing out of that in practical life. So he's not just giving his opinion, but I think he's using inspired logic to communicate what he believes is God's will, but he doesn't have a direct command from the Lord. So to the rest I say, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she agrees to live with him, he must not divorce her. Now, the situation at Corinth involved a lot of people who used to be unbelievers. They used to be pagans. Probably, the two of them probably participated in all kinds of sexually immoral behavior, but then they got married. And and they may have gotten married as unbelievers, but then one of them becomes a believer. And for the unbelieving spouse, a Christian faith and a radical change in lifestyle might be more than that unbelieving spouse can bear. Paul recognizes this. It's just, he's not saying that Jesus wants an unbelieving spouse to, or commands an unbelieving spouse to separate. But that's the logical conclusion of the things that Jesus has taught about the subject of marriage and divorce. So if a unbelieving spouse agrees to live with the believer, then the believer must not divorce the spouse. And then we address it from the other gender perspective. If any woman has a husband who's not a believer and he agrees to live with her, she must not divorce him. So if it's like the choice is left up to the unbeliever. The believer has no choice. He or she is in a marriage that is recognized by God, and unless there is sexual immorality, that believer has no grounds for a divorce, except for the reason Paul's about to introduce. So he's already said if the unbelieving spouse, whether male or female, agrees to live with the believer, then a divorce should not take place. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. And I got to tell you, I don't know what this is teaching. What I'm going to do, I'm going to be kind of like the Apostle Paul. I'm going to draw some logical conclusions and tell you what I think this doesn't mean and what I think it may actually mean. I don't think it means that if you are a believing wife and your husband is an unbeliever, he automatically gets to go to heaven when he dies because you're a believer. I don't think that's what it's saying. That runs counter to everything the Bible has to say about salvation. And the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband, so vice versa. An unbelieving spouse does not get to go to heaven because their spouse believes. So what does this mean? I think it means that if you are an unbelieving husband and you marry a believing wife, which is what I did, and here's how it worked out in my life. I married a believer. She never should have married me. Her parents didn't want her to marry me, but she did. And I don't know if she thought she could influence me and convert me, but that's the way it turned out. I saw the gospel being lived out in her life. And of course, I was in love with her. We were newlyweds. So I was willing to do about anything she suggested. So she suggested that I read the Bible. And, because I had my ulterior motives for doing whatever she said to do, I read the Bible. And over a period of time, over a period of months, I became a believer by reading God's word. Well, that never would have happened, probably. That probably wouldn't have happened if I had married her, because I was not inclined to read the Bible. I thought the Bible was full of errors and contradictions and all that stuff. I found out that it wasn't, but I had, if it wasn't for her, I doubt if I ever would have read the Bible, but I did, and I got saved. So that's how I think, by the influence of a believing spouse, an unbeliever can be drawn to the experience of salvation. And that's how it worked with me. And I think it can work in, either gender direction. But then Paul goes on to say, otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. And I don't think this means that if a married couple is either both believers or one of the two is a believer, that your children automatically go to heaven. And I think this relationship with your children works the same way that it can work with a spouse. If the believer is devoted to and committed to sharing the gospel with children, there's a very good chance that those children will become believers. Now, having said that, let me also say that I do believe that the Bible supports the idea of an age of accountability until which, no, uh, that there is an age of accountability. I don't know exactly what it was. I think in Judaism it was about the age of 12 or 13. But until that age, until the young child reaches the age of accountability, I get the impression that they are just under the umbrella of grace. And if they die before reaching the age of accountability, then they go to heaven. And I would love to talk to you about the practice of bar mitzvah, and I'd like to go back to the Gospels and stuff like that, and kind of follow through on that. But I think I think verse 14 is talking about the influence of a believer in the relationships in a family. Verse 15. But if the unbeliever separates, let him be separated. The brother or sister is not bound. Bound is a significant word here. In such cases, but God has called you to shalom, which is the Hebrew word for peace. Okay. Here, Paul is adding another context or situation that would permit a divorce. So, in other words, we've already said that if you've got a believer and an unbeliever in a marriage, but the unbeliever agrees to stay, then no divorce should happen. But if the unbeliever desires to depart, to be separated, and here again, let's see, it's chorizo, which means to separate, maybe by divorce or maybe just physically, locally. The brother or sister is not bound. Let's see what that word is. What is that word? Oh, doulotai. Wow, doulos, that is like enslaved. Okay, like a marriage like that where you're married to an unbeliever could be like, having to stay in that marriage could be like slavery. Okay, is not bound. Now, the reason the word bound is important is because Yeshua gave the apostles the authority to bind and loose things. Now, one example of binding and loosing is to forgive sins or to retain sins, to bind a person in their sins or to release them from their sins and sins' consequences. But other examples of binding and loosing would be like to take legal principles, theological principles from the old covenant, and either release them under the terms of the new, say, well, that doesn't apply anymore, or to bind them and say it does apply under the new covenant. And Jesus gives examples of both in the Gospels. But the apostles were the 12 who wrote the Bible, who wrote the New Testament. They were authorized to bind and loose stuff, including marriages, including, like they could sit in judgment on a situation and say divorce is permissible in this case or it's not permissible, binding or loosing. So, in that situation where an unbeliever separates, the brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to peace. I will tell you a brief little story here. When my wife and I lived out in Southern California, we had a young pastor friend in the church that we attended that had just recently graduated from seminary and had started his ministry in the church that we attended. And they didn't have any kids at the time. They were married. But I gather that being a pastor's wife was more than his wife could deal with. So she just packed her bags and left. They were living in California. She was from Boston, so she went to the other end of the country, and that was it. I think later on she applied for divorce, but that was a malicious desertion. Now, whether she was an unbeliever or not, I don't know. She was a sweet girl. It just seemed like an ideal marriage, and we were stunned when it happened because you never know what's going on. in a marriage relationship behind the scenes. So that would be an example of malicious desertion. And I don't know if he ever remarried again or not. We started going to a different church, so I kind of lost track of him. So, how do you know, a wife, whether you'll save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So really, verse 16 is kind of the basis for what I was saying about the influence that a believing spouse can have on an unbelieving spouse or children, uh, either believing or unbelieving children. Verse 17, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, let him walk in this way. I give this a rule in all of Messiah's communities, or in all of the churches of Christ, as we would say in English. So I think there is a key paradigm that Paul is giving here. He is saying, I have given you a lot of legal data to deal with, a lot of legal principles, like spiritual legalities that you should consider in making a decision whether you marry or remain single or get divorced or remarry, as the case may be. Uh, but now I think he's saying a lot of your choice should have to do with your sense of calling in your life. What is God calling you to do? Um, to be single, to be married, to be divorced, to remarry if you think you're eligible for that. So only as the Lord has assigned to each one. Remember when Jesus was talking about eunuchs, he said, not everyone can deal with being a eunuch. I mean, some people have no choice. Their parents make a vow, or they're serving probably a king in such a way that, whether they want to or not, they have to be a eunuch. But he says some people become eunuchs like it's a choice they make. And but Jesus recognizes not everybody can do that. Paul is saying here it's a good idea to do that if you can, but be tuned in to the calling God has placed on your life. So here he gives some examples of various callings. Was anyone called when he already had been circumcised? Let him not make himself uncircumcised. Has anyone been called while uncircumcised? Let him not allow himself to be circumcised. So let me say a couple of things about this. In Paul's teaching in Romans chapter 11, where he's talking about the two olive trees, there's a good cultivated olive tree and there's a wild olive tree. The good cultivated olive tree is the tree of Israel and Judaism. The wild olive tree is the tree of the Gentiles. And Paul says there in Romans chapter 11 that because of unbelief, a lot of branches from the good olive tree, in other words, Jewish people, have been cut off and cast aside. So the unbelievers have been removed from the tree of Israel and Judaism. And a lot of believing branches from the wild olive tree have been grafted into the good olive tree of Israel and Judaism, which implies that when a Gentile becomes a believer in Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, he's grafted into the tree of Israel and becomes Jewish. Okay, with that in mind, verse 18 applies. Was anyone called when he already had been circumcised? So that would be a Jewish person who becomes a believer in Jesus. Now, under the terms of the new covenant, circumcision is neither demanded or forbidden. It's kind of up to the individual. And most circumcisions take place when in infancy. So the parents make the decision. At a later stage in life, it may be a personal decision on the part of an adult male. But so if any of these men were already circumcised and they become believers, let him not make himself uncircumcised. In other words, a Jewish person who becomes a believer in Yeshua, since uh, the requirement to be circumcised is a part of the old covenant, but it's optional under the new covenant, that Jewish guy might say, well, I'll make myself uncircumcised. Now, some of you may be scratching your heads and saying, how can a person be uncircumcised? Because circumcision removes a part of the human flesh and discards it, I assume. So how can you be uncircumcised if that part of you has already been cut off? Well, I looked it up. I did some research on this and found that there was a method whereby if a person wanted to be, or at least appear to be uncircumcised, having already been circumcised at one point in their life, they could go through, let me say it this way, they could go through some physical therapy to bring about a stretching of the the appropriate flesh, and they could have the appearance of having been uncircumcised. Paul says, don't do that. If you're a Jewish person and you've been circumcised and you become a believer, then stay circumcised. Has anyone been called while uncircumcised? In other words, you're a Gentile. Let him not allow himself to be circumcised. Now, that's actually not the best interpretation of this. Kekletai tis. Me parabates. Well, it's not, yeah, it's not that bad. Kekletai. May. Well, yeah, I guess I would have to go along with that. Yeah, here's the situation that might arise. If I'm a Gentile and I become a believer in Yeshua, and I know I'm grafted into the olive tree of Israel and Judaism, and I know that circumcision was required when that tree was planted under the old covenant, but in the new covenant, it's optional. Paul is saying, I know you can be circumcised, but don't do. I recommend that you not do that. Now, this is tricky because in a passage in the book of Acts, when Paul befriends Timothy, and I think Timothy was from Galatia, one of the communities in Galatia. Timothy had a Jewish mom and grandma, but his dad was Greek, and so he wasn't circumcised when he was young. But in order to avoid offending the Jews in the community there who would know that, Paul encouraged him to be circumcised. I think the choice was up to Timothy, but he went along with that and he was circumcised. So circumcision for Gentiles, when they become believers, is not forbidden. It says, let him not allow himself to be circumcised. It sounds like forbidding it, but it's not, because Paul encouraged Timothy to be circumcised. See how challenging this stuff is? Verse 19, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping God's commandments matters. Circumcision was a sacrament, I'll call it, of the old covenant. It was given to Abraham, but it was incorporated into the law of Moses. And the thing that it was supposed to symbolize, and the significance of it, was that a portion of the sinful flesh was surgically removed and discarded. And that was supposed, the idea of putting off of the sinful flesh was the lesson that was supposed to be taught by circumcision. Under the new covenant is for believers only. So the putting off of the flesh does not require the fleshly reminder. Your whole life should be a life of like spiritual circumcision. So here is one of the places where, under the tenets of the new covenant. Circumcision is not required or forbidden. It's, Paul says it's nothing. Let each one remain in the calling in which he was called. So your circumcision or uncircumcision status is one of the areas where you should apply this principle of remain in the condition you were in when God called you. Were you called as and here's another application of that. Were you called as a slave? Don't let that bother you. But if indeed you can become free, make the most of the opportunity. So in other words, if you're a slave and you become a believer, you become a Christian. And that was a lot of slaves in the Roman Empire became believers in Christ because it kind of set them free spiritually and they loved it. But Paul is saying you don't need to, first of all, don't let that bother you. And you need not pursue freedom. But freedom is better than slavery, Paul would acknowledge. So if you have the opportunity to become free, go ahead and take advantage of it. Like sometimes a slave could buy his own freedom. So if you want to be free, save up your money and set yourself free. But if you can't do that or you're not inclined to do that, don't let it bother you. Okay, so that's the application for slave or free. For the one who was called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's free man. So even though you might be physically in the flesh, a slave, from God's perspective, you're as free as the breeze. Likewise, the one who was called while free is the Messiah's slave. So if you're a slave owner, say, and you become a believer in Yeshua, you get to be a slave too. You become a spiritual, relational slave to Yeshua. He is your master. And Paul calls himself a doulos, the Greek word for a slave, all the time. He views himself as a slave, and he was certainly a free man. He was a very well-off individual, but through faith in Yeshua, he has become a slave of God. You were bought with a price. Do not become the slaves of men. So if you're free, don't get yourself in a situation where you have to become a slave if you can avoid it. But if that does happen to you, don't let it bother you. Okay, brothers and sisters, let each one in whatever way or condition he was called remain that way with God. Now, if you go against that advice and you get yourself circumcised or uncircumcised, or if you change your status from slave to free or free to slave, not a big problem. It's just not Paul's counsel to you. Now, concerning virgins, I have no command from the Lord. So, in other words, Jesus isn't giving him commands to communicate to the Corinthians. But again, he's going to use his inspired logic to provide some guidance here. Concerning virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Oh, I am one of us. Mercy on the Lord. I was going to look up what the word opinion is, but epitagte, I don't have a commandment of the Lord. I don't know what the word opinion is. I'm not that good with the Greek. Okay, so now the problem here is the word virgins. Now, what that could mean is if you're a dad and you have a single daughter, so she would be, your daughter would be your virgin. But you could also be in a dating relationship or even an engaged relationship with a single girl who was a virgin. So it could be her fiance or her boyfriend. And I think the term virgin could also, in a symbolic way, be applied to a male as well. So this unmarried person, Paul's going to give his advice, and he thinks it's trustworthy. I think then, because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Okay. This Verse 26 tends to mitigate against the idea that the authority person in the virgin's life is her dad, because he's probably not a single. So I think this favors the idea that the person in this particular situation has an opportunity to go, like, is either engaged or is in a dating relationship and has the opportunity to go through with the marriage. Paul is saying because of the present distress, that's not necessarily a good idea. So he says to the single guy, I would recommend that you consider staying single. So what is the present distress? The church was being persecuted, first of all, by the Pharisaic and Sadducean Jews, and later by the Romans. The dividing line there is about 64 AD, or Common Era. Nero really started the Roman persecution of the Christians. But Christians were being persecuted by two groups here. So Paul is saying, because of persecution, you may be better off single. So, if you end up being tortured and put to death, then it's just you. You're not going to leave a widow. You're not going to leave orphaned children, or a single mom to take care of your kids. So that's kind of the idea here. Stay single if you can handle it. Are you bound to a wife? Now that sounds like a married man. Don't seek divorce. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek a wife. So let's look at 27 in the Greek. The word here is not chorisai, but it's lelusai, which is the standard word for divorce. So, it sounds like, are you bound to a wife? Again, is your marriage legitimate? Then don't be seeking a divorce. It may even be saying, if your wife is committing adultery, don't seek a divorce. I don't think so, because that exception is already given. So are you bound to a wife? Don't seek a divorce. Don't think God is calling you to singleness if you're married, unless the circumstances of your marriage are such that the two of you have to be celibate, like she can't have sex anymore, or you can't have sex anymore. Don't seek a divorce of that. Are you free from a wife? In other words, are you single or are you divorced? Don't seek a wife is Paul's advice. So he says, my advice to you is, if you are eligible, we'll say, don't go seeking a spouse. But he continues in verse 28, but if you marry, you have not sinned. Now, this is where the idea that a divorced person is no longer bound by the first marriage and would be free to remarry. But that's only the case if the word luce here in the Greek is a reference to a divorced person. So I guess what I would say is, if you're a divorced person, you may or may not be permitted by God to remarry. See, and this is in the section where it deals with God's calling in your life, and that complicates things quite a bit. So if you marry, we'll say, if you're divorced and you remarry, it doesn't say remarry, it says marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Now, technically, a virgin would be a woman who has never been married, has never been physically intimate with a man. So she can go ahead and get married if she chooses to do so. Paul's advice to her would be to remain single. Yet such people will have trouble in this fleshly life, and I'm trying to spare you. So persecution is one thing, but he's going to go on to explain how marriage can complicate your life. But this I say, brothers and sisters, the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none. Now, a lot of husbands, when they read that, particularly if they don't like their wife, they can say, oh, I get to do whatever I want, and I can just ignore my wife and pretend like she doesn't exist. That's not what he's talking about. But what it does mean is like, don't be dependent on your spouse to resolve all your sexual urges. He says the time is short, so like get yourself under control. Verse 30, and those who weep as though not weeping, those who rejoice as though not rejoicing, those who buy as though not possessing. So Paul is saying the time is short, and this recognition, because of persecution, because of the possibility of the nearness of the return of Christ, because of the possibility of the beginning of the Great Tribulation at any point, particular point in time, he's saying, don't orient yourself around marriage because you or your spouse might be imprisoned, might be tortured, might be put to death. It's something Paul would like to avoid happening in your situation. But it also includes like your attitude towards weeping and mourning. Um, you know, um, rejoicing as though not rejoicing. Don't get happy about worldly stuff. I guess it would mean don't weep and mourn about earthly stuff, and don't rejoice about earthly stuff. Don't orient your life around buying a lot of possessions just because of the circumstances, which were in place in the biblical era and are still in place today. Christ could come at any time. The Great Tribulation could start at any time. So those who use the world as though not using it to the fullest, for the present form of this world is passing away. Each day brings us closer to the kingdom of Messiah and the new heavens and the new earth. But I want you to be free from cares, which would be what? Like anxieties and stuff like that. The word is doeg in the Hebrew. What is it? Merimna? Cares. Yeah, merimna in the Greek. So don't worry about worldly stuff. Put your focus on the Lord. Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all these things will be added to it. But the married man cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. So if you're married, what this means is your priorities are going to be divided. You're going to be spending a lot of time trying to make your wife's life good, which you should do, but that's going to take time away from your focus on the Lord. So that married man is divided in his loyalties and the time and attention he can give to stuff, to people, and to God. The unmarried woman, as well as the virgin, cares about the things of the Lord, so that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But the married woman cares about the things of the world, that how she may please her husband. So both of these groups, like for males and females, if you remain single, you can totally 100% of your time can be given to the Lord, and that's a good thing. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to be single, you got to behave yourself. You can't be defeated by your sex drive. So even Jesus acknowledges not everybody can accept that. Verse 35. Now I say this for your own benefit, not to put restraint on you, but to promote proper and constant service to the Lord without distraction. So Paul is saying here, there are a lot of reasons for giving you the advice that I've given you: persecution, just practical matters, relationships between believers and unbelievers. But the main thing is to promote proper and constant service to the Lord without distraction. So a really focused attention on God and his will for you and the ministry that he's given you. Verse 36. But if any man thinks he is behaving inappropriately toward his virgin, if the time is ripe and it is meant to be, let him do what he decides. He does not sin, let them marry. I think this is talking about an engaged couple or a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they are getting close enough to each other that their sex drive is becoming overwhelming. And they may, start engaging in a little bit of petting and foreplay and stuff like that. They try to avoid, sexual intimacy, but These things are leading down that road. So Paul is saying, if that's the case and you feel like it's God's will and part of your calling, go ahead and let them marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, who has no pressure, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his own heart to keep her a virgin, he will do well. So that could be talking about an espoused fiance who has basically the authority to go through with the marriage or call the marriage off. Paul says, do whatever you want to do. So, yeah, so he who stands firm in his heart, who has no pressure, but has power in his own will and is determined in his own to keep her a virgin. In other words, not to get married and leave her a virgin. Of course, she would be eligible to marry someone else if she chooses to do so. He will do well. So it's okay not to get married. In fact, it's a good thing not to get married. Could this be a reference to a dad who has a virgin daughter? And the dad may be thinking, well, my daughter's got a boyfriend, or maybe she's even engaged, but they haven't come together sexually. And I, the dad, feel like God's will for my daughter is that she serve him with 100% of her life and focus, particularly if she goes along with it. Then the dad can call off the marriage. So then both he who marries the virgin does well, and he who doesn't marry her does. It doesn't say well, it says better. So Paul's advice to everybody, no matter what your relational situation is, be as single as you can be. Focus as much of your time on the Lord as you can. Verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. Remember the marriage vow, till death do us part. But if her husband dies, she's free to be married to anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. So for a person who has been married but has lost their spouse, a widow or a widower, they are free to remarriage. But he adds this thing, only in the Lord. So consult the Lord first. And as much as in your power, as much as you can tell and detect in the person that you're considering marrying, only marry a believer. Don't be unequally yoked. And I know unequally yoked applies to more than marriage, but it does apply to marriage. But in my judgment, she is happier, probably he is happier, if she or he stays as he or she is. And I think that I have the Ruach Elohim, which is Hebrew for the Spirit of God. So Paul's been doling out a lot of advice. It's not just his opinion. It is logical reasoning based on the principles and the commands that God has given. So he's been doling that stuff out, and he's acknowledging that, he's owning that, but he's saying, I think I have the Spirit of God on this. In other words, the conclusions I've come to have been given to me by the Spirit of Elohim, by the Spirit of God. And I'm really pleased to see chapter 8 come up here, because this stuff is exhausting, trying to figure out from the various possibilities there are of the circumstances that Paul is talking about. And you want to know what God's will is in your life. No matter what your status is, you want to know what his will is and what your options are. And you want to live your life in a way that's God-pleasing. But you're not sure what he's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7. That may be because we live 2,000 years separate from the time in which Paul lived. Maybe this stuff made more sense to the first century reader and hearer. But it's challenging stuff. And if you stayed through the whole hour and a half of video that we've done, I commend you for your stick-to-itiveness and your desire to learn God's will and apply it to your life. So let me give you a blessing for that. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. And I hope you'll join me next time for 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Shalom.